You're listening to The Moth of Glen Mailey. Orla didn't bother turning the light on in the kitchen as she dropped her plastic bag on the counter. She knew the house well, so she didn't need to rack up Shannon's electric bill. The dark never bothered her anyway. It was Grandma Shannon's house, after all, the same halls she traipsed in many times as a kid, at night in summers of her past, to sample some late-night pastry or watch a meteor shower happening over the trees. The cat gave a rusty croak from somewhere in the living room as she opened up the fridge. She tapped out a bit of wet food onto the dish and put it near her water bowl. "Anya," she called out to the cat, "come have your dinner." Orla straightened out and groaned. It was the start of autumn now, but she was still feeling herself sweating, standing still, her hair frizzing from the humidity in real time. The dead, hot air in the cabin felt stifling, and she grimaced, wondering where she'd packed away her bonnet. This heat was definitely something she didn't miss about visiting Shannon. Except she wasn't visiting Shannon, exactly, she reminded herself. Shannon was in Florida settling the affairs of her brother, who, in all honesty, Orla's family had never really talked about. Orla snapped a twist-off cap on her gas station wine and sighed softly as she drank it straight out the bottle. It was strange not having Shannon here running her little cottage. She was such a big personality that the tiny house seemed to grow a few inches outward without her presence, and it was quiet. Not a visitor, burning stove, or pot of sludgy coffee in sight. But the cottage stood nonetheless, peaceful, just a list of chores and a mean old cat who never let anyone touch her. And the woods sat, just like they always did, on the other side of the clearing, still green and overgrown in early October. Life in New York had overtaken Orla, especially since it felt so much like she had so much more to prove. So much more had to be done in her early years in the city, attending NYU, scraping pennies together to ride the subway to school, divvying up her Chinese food orders to last several days, catching naps between class and her shifts at work. So many years had been gobbled up cutting her teeth after college, getting certified, and working every grueling unpaid intern gig that was handed to her. But in Glen Mailey, few things had changed, even in the span of 6 or 7 years. Time was allowed to rest here by the foot of the mountains. That's why she supposed she didn't visit sooner. In some ways, in the back of her mind, Glen Mailey was what it had always been, a series of aging hollers dotted along the skirt of the mountain, dark bark of the bristling hemlocks, twisting dirt roads and rusting sheds, standing alone in the green, overgrown fields. Nothing had changed here, or had wanted to change in ages, and that tide didn't seem to be turning anytime soon. Even so, she felt a small guilt creep into her at the realization that the first time she'd visited in years, Shannon wasn't even here. More than anything else, she didn't really miss Glen Mailey or anything in it, except for the memory she still had here with Shannon. She felt the mercy enter her body when the shitty wine finally reached her empty stomach. The stop-start nightmare of air travel and taxi rides slid away as she felt the buzz of alcohol warm the edges of her world. She decided now would be a good time to change out of her travel clothes and take her wine out on the back porch. Orla grabbed the wine bottle by its neck and took it with her into the old back bedroom. She rustled in the dark through the contents of her luggage and fished out an old, oversized Cummins Falls tee, moth-bitten to shit. She nodded, an appropriate choice. It was one of her most overloved, faded shirts. It had been with her all through college, and it had taken quite a few trips with her here when she was younger. In some ways, the shirt had just as much right to be here as she did. Orla shimmied out of her jeans and her blouse, draping them back over the luggage. The cotton of her t-shirt shifted softly around her, and she padded out of the bedroom's sliding door, out onto the back patio. She snapped the sliding door closed behind her, and her senses shifted from the ordered quiet of Shannon's house to the gentle, constant burble of the land behind the house. She could feel the rustling night air brush against her bare ankles and arms, bringing her chaotic day of travel to rest. Crows sat in the far-off line of trees on the other side of the creek, crowing idly as the sun sank behind the dark clot of pointed treetops. The cool, mottled wood of the deck felt good against her bare feet. She knew this property well enough at this point that it felt like she could avoid every splinter and weak plank on the old back porch. Her eyes swept across the perimeter of the property, the contents of the back porch, to make sure that Shannon hadn't absent-mindedly left any garbage out. She didn't exactly want any unexpected nighttime visitors. The small lantern out back, she figured she could skip lighting while she was here. If she was alone, she supposed there'd be no need, really, to light the lantern like she normally did for Shannon. The old woman liked to take late-night cups of coffee back there and contemplate the stars over a long, drawn-out series of cigarettes. She always made sure to light the lantern for herself at night, a force of habit that Orla had picked up. She settled down between the posts of the porch stairs and took another hearty swig from the neck of the wine bottle. As the traffic of her thoughts slowed, her thoughts wandered back to what the gas station attendant could have meant. Seen anything? The question wormed its way under her skin. The velvety, tannic feeling of wine washed around the back of her mouth as she searched her memories. Had she seen things up here as a kid? Yeah, all kids did, she was pretty sure. Her siblings, aunts and uncles, anyone that could remember far back enough, all shared stories of the things they'd seen near the woods and on the property. And even though a lot of it was simply fiction brought on to scare the children, or from the fever of moonshine, a lot of them still had the heebie-jeebies about the property as a whole. But Orla, Shannon's property had always been peaceful. It was just weird. She remembered seeing shadows out there on the same porch as a more imaginative, impressionable kid. Memory was a clear one. Orla was only about 8, maybe 9 at the time. Grandmother Shannon asked her to light the lantern on the back porch, and while she agreed, she'd also been dawdling on the porch as night began to fall. There were so many lightning bugs to catch and cup with her clasped hands on the porch, and for quite some time she'd almost forgotten entirely about the lantern at all. Overhead, she heard the foop-foop of wings in the dark and ducked, catching a dark object sweep past her hair. She waved the object away, and so in the dim light from Shannon's window, it was a bat, with a gigantic gray moth caught in its hind legs. The urge to scream bubbled up in her small chest, but instead, she shot out her arm and batted the animal away with her hand. The bat dropped its prey on the ground, twitching, as it dove into spiraling circles back into the night air. Orla cringed at the encounter in the dark, her body suddenly feeling cold in the evening. She quickly made a point to light the lantern and run back across the porch, shivering and anxious to get inside the bug and bat-free interior of Shannon's cabin. As she did, however, she stopped right before the door, realizing the large moth had not flown away to safety yet and sat, stranded on the planks of the porch now illuminated by the lantern light. She squatted down and peered at the moth, weary after their first meeting. It sat, upturned and belly up, legs giving a tired struggle to grasp the air above it. Something within its exposed, vulnerable, moon-white belly made her heart ache with pity. Orla reached over and very carefully scooped up the moth, making sure not to damage the delicate wings like Shannon had taught her. She looked down into her cupped hands. The moth stopped moving, legs freezing in the air. Her heart gave a squeeze, realizing she must have handled the dying moth too roughly in its last moments. Orla's eyes began to sting with tears, blurring the details of the large moth. Gentle. She should have been more gentle. She blinked and felt a fat tear roll down her rounded cheek and splash down into her cupped palm. The moth stirred, giving her a scare as it gave a mighty push with its wings and took into the air. She jumped, watching it take flight. The powder gray moth landed on the lantern, and she distinctly remembered, in the lantern's light and the blurred view through her tears, the moth's shadow was cast long and wide, far larger and longer than any shadow of a moth had any right to be. She remembered how much in the dark it looked like the moth's shadow shifted and grew into something more human, long, lanky legs and slender arms, sweeping wings and delicate draped finery. In some ways, if you look through the lens of childhood imagination, it was a beautiful memory, one that many kids would have cherished, she figured. It was hard to remember why exactly, but the memory had always been labeled in her mind as inappropriate, like she had stumbled across an adult conversation happening above her head, or a concept she had not yet been prepared to understand. Something large and unknown, moving outside of her scope of understanding, but too close for comfort. Back then, it had felt like all things were real, and all magic was palpable. But this particular memory, it felt like what she'd run into was perhaps something that was not meant to be her business. She supposed in some ways it was her right as yet another family member who had experienced something inexplicable here on Shannon's property. But maybe kids were just gullible like that, she considered, hungry to find glimmers of the uncanny in waking life. And, Orla supposed, maybe the real vehicle in making magic feel truly real was the lack of life's disappointments. Reality had not yet shrunk the world down to size and made it mundane. Orla took another swig of acidic wine and let her eyes glaze over as she stared into the wooded distance. She missed how sultry and laden with wonder these backwoods used to feel as a kid, how the lightning bugs used to duck in and out of the curtain of branches of the old weeping willow that sat stooped over the creek. These were the same gnarled branches she used to hang on to as a child, like an old rope to swing over the side of the creek that divided the property. She missed picking tart pine berries and softly sweet mulberries in the far reaches of the property and eating them out of the stained cotton of her grubby t-shirt. But the reality of things was, no matter how bright and clear the stars were out here in Glen Mailey, where the rambling blue-green hills went on forever, magic had died when the towns had grown old and irreparably in disrepair. Kids didn't come out here to the aging town anymore like they used to, and even Orla viewed a summer stay at Glen Mailey as something of a throwback. From the constant round-the-clock noise of Ditmas Park and Manhattan, the hushed tones of crickets, cicadas, and the trickle of the dying creek seemed surreal, quaint, bordering on boring. Though the susurrus of the wind through the trees and the chorus of crickets was already filling the darkening evening, she found herself feeling her familiar surroundings become surreal in the change of light. Her eyes noted how the light began to shift as it sunk down behind the trees. Like light, when it passed through a crystal, the forest had a quality of absorbing sunlight into its dense mass, reflecting the light back out at odd, uncanny angles. The pine berries and mulberries were already past season, she figured, as she took another slug from the neck of the bottle. So she might as well enjoy the rest of the wine. The tart, cheap drink sparkled on her tongue with a sugary, artificial sort of carbonation, but she could almost feel a glow of relief as she felt the buzz of wine softly continue to numb her jangled nerve endings. She ignored the gentle nausea that the sugar gave her, and instead focused on the purpling clot of darkening trees. She heard something shuffle in the crisp, dried leaves in the ground. She jumped, startled by how close the sound was, until she reminded herself that rabbits liked to linger on the perimeter of the property in the low shrubbery. Orla laughed at herself, shaking off the sudden spike of unexpected fear. Here she was trying to unwind, and she was working herself up with ghost stories. As if on cue, a large droplet of rain fell from the sky, splashing unexpectedly on her warm scalp. A few more drops splashed onto the deck beside her, darkening the wood. A low hum overtook the property as the rain began to fall onto the foliage. It was as good a time as any, she recognized, to pack it in. She felt herself wet and overtaken by exhaustion and got up, the full weight and stress of the day finally hitting her all at once. The door snapped shut behind her, and she began her nightly routine of locking up and checking all the cabin's old windows and doors. She shuffled into the main bedroom and left the door slightly ajar to keep the air fresh. She settled bonelessly into the old comforter and sighed, and before she knew it, she was carried away to sleep. When she woke again, she realized with a distinct awareness that it was not morning and something had roused her. The city paranoia clicked in, and she let her complete awareness descend on her ears to see if she could hear any intruders or potentially any bears that had broken in. It was silent, save for the raging rainstorm outside and a strange sort of tapping sound. She lay back down and wagered it was something tapping against the house in the rain, but she found it hard to close her eyes and go back to sleep. After a few minutes of trying, she sighed, pulling back the comforter and grabbing the flashlight from under Shannon's bed. Orla clicked it on and padded down the hallway, listening for the noise. It wasn't coming from the front door or the kitchen. She frowned, looking around for the cat. "Anya," she called into the dark, hearing no response. The tapping continued. She followed the sound through the cabin and into the bathroom, startled by the sudden change of temperature and humidity in the room. She realized why when she looked up to see what was causing the sound. The bathroom window was pushed upwards, open, and letting in copious amounts of rain all over onto the toilet, vanity, and floor. She grabbed towels and started to mop up the mess, realizing that she still hadn't heard from the cat. "Anya," she called again, her stomach twisting with worry when she thought about the possibility of the cat jumping through the window in a rainstorm. The cat was an indoor cat through and through, and barely even liked being close to the door. She doubted in a rainstorm of all times the cat would be pulled to take a trip outdoors. She flicked at the bathroom light, and her heart sunk when nothing happened. She fiddled with the switch momentarily before finding the same in the other room. The cat was gone. The power was out. Really? She shook her head in the dark. Orla squared her jaw and slipped on Shannon's old work boots by the door. Clicking the flashlight up to the next setting, she headed outside through the back door in Shannon's bedroom. Rain came down without end, the gutter on the other side of the house absolutely overwhelmed with a deluge of water. She prayed for her hair, then for her safety, and then walked out into the rain, sweeping her flashlight across the porch. "Anya," she cried, tired, now wet and uncomfortable on top of it all. All she wanted was to be back in a warm bed, not pulling firewood piles apart to see if the old cat was hidden inside. When she was nowhere to be found, she descended down the porch stairs out into the property. She stepped into the long wet grass and shined her flashlight out, where it immediately felt swallowed and dwarfed by the dark. Somewhere in the back of her brain, the fear of danger out here alone threatened to overtake her. Did something open that window? She thought, shaking her head. She could have sworn she locked everything up before bed. She always did. Maybe she hadn't, though, and her exhaustion had gotten the better of her. And now the cat was prowling around on the property because she hadn't been paying attention. Orla pursed her lips and tried to stop catastrophizing in her head, trying to keep her mind on the task at hand. She didn't love Anya, but Shannon cared for the old mean cat like another child, and if the old woman returned and Anya was lost, Orla would never forgive herself. She tromped out into the slick grass, trying not to lose her footing out into any unseen gopher holes and puddles. "Anya," she called, shining her flashlight around in slow, sweeping arcs, wondering if she should have brought a snack bag or something to lure her back inside. Thunder clapped overhead and then rumbled through the mountain like a disapproving god buried deep in the hills. "Anya!" she shouted, soaked and growing more anxious by the minute. What if she'd gotten eaten by something out here? She'd been asleep for hours already. She neared the creek that split off the property, seeing it overflowing by its rocky bank into the grass. The water ran fast, carrying storm debris with it downriver. That worried her. Her flashlight beam caught the very tip of something, sticking out just above the tall grass. She stopped, bringing back the light, seeing the wet outline of the cat crouched in the grass several feet up ahead. Its eyes were trained on something farther ahead, across the water. "Anya, you dumb cat, there you are!" She huffed, trailing after the cat in the grass to pick her up. Anya turned her head to look at her calmly. She did not look scared or even happy to see Orla, simply distracted from a more important task at hand, which she did not know. She turned to train her eyes back on what she'd been looking at. Orla laughed. "Anya, it's a little late in poor weather to be hunting mice right now. Come on, let's go." She reached down, looking forward to drying them both off and being back in bed. Anya looked back to see Orla reaching down and leapt away, bounding towards the creek. Orla panicked, afraid of the stupid old cat getting swept up in the flooding creek. "Anya!" She tried to dive down to grasp the cat, but slipped on the muddy grass, coming down hard on one of her knees. She grunted, and the wind was taken out of her. "Oof, this fucking cat is gonna get it," she muttered. Orla got back to her feet, bounding after the cat, the circle of light from her flashlight bouncing in the dark. She could feel mud on her shoes and the sharp pain on her knees. She chased through the dark, wondering what the hell she was even doing. The cat leapt over the creek in one easy motion, diving into the grass beyond. She jumped after her, not quite making as graceful of a clearance. Her boots landed in the overrun water, making her wobble for an uncertain moment on the slick rocks. The cat kept running, to Orla's terror, straight for the tree line. There wouldn't be a chance in hell that she could find Anya in these woods in the dark, especially not during a thunderstorm. Orla pushed her tired legs to close the distance between them, no longer caring if she slipped or hurt herself in the process. The cat began to cut through the small saplings and the shrubs at the very base of the woods, and Orla's heart began to pump so hard in her chest that she thought it would burst before she even made it to the tree line. Her speed finally kicked in just as her breath ran short, and she managed to close the gap as Anya began to wiggle her way through a gnarled, twisted bush with a gap in the center only large enough to accommodate a cat or a small creature. Without thinking, Orla dove in after the cat through the bushes, letting go of the flashlight to grab Anya with both hands. She caught the cat, just a wet, angry set of bones with fur. The cat yowled in protest, squirming to get out of her grasp. "Would you just calm down?" Orla snapped. The cat slashed her across the chest and dove out of her arms through the small gap. "Fucking..." Orla set the pain aside at the cat scratch and dove down to squeeze herself through the impossibly tight gap in the bushes. She felt the dry, brittle branches of hawthorn scratch the sides of her face as she tried to claw through. She barely could see anything up ahead in the dark, just the sounds of the cat rustling through the bushes up ahead. In the low shaft of light coming through the downed flashlight behind her, she tried to take a deep breath and focus her eyes in the dark. As she did, something heavy snapped a twig up ahead. Her eyes scanned the small gap in the shrubs to see what it was, heart thundering in her chest. If there was a larger animal out there with Anya, it was game over. She watched a tall, lanky shadow, something she had sworn was just a sapling, suddenly fold and bend, leaning downwards. The shape changed in the dark as her eyes struggled to make sense of what she was actually looking at. The shadow dropped down, and she looked straight ahead into the shaft of light and saw a set of red eyes reflecting back at her in the dark. Not round like Anya's or a raccoon's, too high off the ground for either, and large, forward-facing eyes, predator. Her brain clicked into place with sickening speed. The tickling sense of mortal danger kicked in, skipping across the nerve endings on her scalp. You saw a lot of weird things out here in the mountains, which is why it was important to be mindful when you were out in the woods at night, which was maybe why it was important not to cross the stream, especially after dark. Shannon had always said, "Keep the light with you." Orla's heart drowned out the sound of thunder overhead, eyes transfixed on those watching her, through the tight knot of hawthorn, unblinking, reflective red in the unimaginable dark. She was Tennessee born and raised, and it didn't matter how long she'd lived as a city slicker, she knew enough from growing up in these mountains her whole life. It was time to go. Thanks for listening. The miniseries returns with part 2 on October 5th, and then again on October 10th with part 3. Can't wait to see you there, and whatever you do, don't cross the river into the woods.